What's up, everybody? It's Yong here with a Metal Gear Solid 5 news update. I have got a very interesting segment for you today. The information that I'll be relaying in this video comes from an interview that Famitsu did with Kenji Yano, a Kadokawa staff member who was responsible for writing the book Metal Gear Solid Naked, a standalone book that dissects the Metal Gear series in minute detail, along with the planning and editing of the MGS novelizations by authors Project Ito, Satoshi Hase, and Hitori Nojima. In other words, Kenji Yano knows his Metal Gear shit. The full interview was published in article form back in December of 2015, but it wasn't until recently that the interview received a full translation, which Kojima linked to on his Twitter, and its contents are compelling to say the least. The entire interview basically focused on Kenji Yano's interpretation of Phantom Pain's story, which yielded some really cool insight that may have you looking at MGS5 in a different light, along with new information that you may not have known about the game's development history. Now, normally for videos like this, I would try to paraphrase and abridge the information to only relay the important bits, but this is one of those rare cases in which every word is vital to conveying the full message, so I'll simply be reading the entire interview to you. As for my in-depth thoughts, opinions, and analysis on the piece, I'll be doing that in a follow-up video. Now, the article does begin with an interesting excerpt stating the following. Was Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain released in an unfinished state? That's the question that's been making the rounds on the internet since the game's release. Elements such as Venom Snake's true identity, the disappearance of Episode 51, and the nuclear disarmament objective in FOB online missions have left some fans wondering what to make of it. We talked to the person most suited to answering these concerns, MGS series expert Kenji Yano. Then, after a profile of Kenji Yano, the article dives into the interview, which goes as follows. We want to get your interpretation of the story of MGS5, but first, we have a question to ask. Sure, go ahead. It's about something that happened a little after MGS5's release. Hideo Kojima tweeted a comment that MGS5 should be forever an empty space. How should we interpret this concept of an empty space? And here's the tweet for those wondering what that's all about, and it's translated as V liberates Snake from the bonds of fate, and by passing the baton to the player, who was previously bound to Snake, they can bring the legend full circle. This parting of ways should not become some phantom pain, but an empty space that, by remaining unfilled, serves as motivation for the player to move forward. Yano responded with, "That's a difficult question to start off with. I think that's Kojima-san saying, there's this empty space, and it's never meant to be filled. There will always be a hero in that space. It's because it's empty that we have room to move forward and make progress. That space is at the heart of V." That's how Kojima-san wraps up his interpretation of the MGS5 novelization. So what is this empty space? An important motif in MGS5 is Moby Dick, and its titular white whale symbolizes an empty space. In that case, perhaps we should start by discussing the connections to the novel Moby Dick. Absolutely, I think that's a good place to begin. Moby Dick is an epic novel published by Herman Melville in 1851. Everyone's heard of Moby Dick and knows roughly that it's about Captain Ahab and his quest for revenge against Moby Dick, the gigantic sperm whale that bit off his leg. We know the story entails him guiding the whaling ship Pequod on a journey to hunt and kill Moby Dick, all of which is narrated by a character called Ishmael. Having played the game, all those names certainly ring a bell. Exactly, the player gets called Ahab in MGS5, and the mystery figure who guides him calls himself Ishmael. The chopper that becomes Snake's home away from home is codenamed Pequod, and the fake Swedish development studio used to announce the mysterious new project, The Phantom Pain, in 2012 was called Moby Dick Studio. This later turned out to be a ruse by Hideo Kojima. So why the references to Moby Dick? Kojima-san actually explained to me personally back in 2011 how MGS5 would be structured. At that point, all the elements were already in place, the themes of Phantom Pain, the vocal cord parasites, race and retaliation, and of course the Moby Dick motif. However, at that point Ishmael was actually Huey, Snake was Ahab, and Diamond Dog's enemy was America. It was set up so that the story, being told by Huey, Ishmael, as an American citizen, would be biased toward the American perspective, showing America being right the whole time. Why the narrator role changed from being Huey to Big Boss is something we'll go to later. That's a pretty huge revelation to come out with all of a sudden. Let's look at these points one by one. To begin with, tell us more about the Moby Dick connection. A little before the novel Moby Dick came out, in the 17th to 18th centuries, whaling was a worldwide industry. Rather than just being a food source, whales were a source of energy that kept the world going. Of course, their oil was prized, but also other parts such as the bones and baleen, hair-like filter in the mouth, played an important role in people's lifestyles. The baleen, for example, was used to make the frames for hoop skirts and corsets, and served as sofa springs and umbrella spokes. World maps are thought to have come out thanks to the whaling trade. In short, whaling was inseparable from people's lives at the time. You could even say that it had infiltrated their lives. Whales as a source of energy, that's pretty hard to imagine from a modern perspective. Of course, whaling began to die out, and in the present day is moving toward being outlawed altogether. And naturally, the reason it died out was that other energy sources replaced whales. Coal gave rise to steam locomotion, which gave way to crude oil, and then electrical power, and now we live in an age of nuclear power. Basically, whales back then occupied the same vital position as nuclear energy does today. Apparently, even as late as World War I, whale oil was being used as an ingredient in explosives, as an energy source that was repurposed for destruction. It's again the same as nuclear power. Interesting, so there are plenty of parallels. MGS fans will know what I mean by this. On the surface level, MGS titles always have the anti-war, anti-nuclear armaments themes, but they also deal with a particular thing that defines the times, the system of the world on the whole, if you like. At the root of that, if we think of what power drives the world, nowadays it would be nuclear energy. Tracing the path back from there leads directly to whales as the past energy source. So in a way, I think it was inevitable that MGS would explore this theme, the light and dark of energy. Progress and energy casts an even brighter light to guide our progress as a global society, but the brighter it grows, the shadows also get darker. Kojima-san has always been one to tenaciously drag this fact out into the open. This applies to nuclear energy, to genetics, and to culture itself. So both Moby Dick and MGS5 use whales as an allegory for the power making the world go round. What's important is that Kojima didn't just transplant the motif from Moby Dick. I think it's more a case of these two creators, Melville and Kojima, relentlessly thinking through the way that the world works and arriving at the same answer. So we have a 19th century author and a 21st century game designer pursuing the same thing. From this perspective, I think it's fair to say that Kojima-san's imagination has made a connection with world literature. And of course, if we look at the game from the energy perspective, it's obvious that Afghanistan and Africa would be the settings for the events in MGS5. Each produces oil, and each is a source of rare metals and other mined resources. Come to think of it, this year, Mamoru Hosoda's The Boy and the Beast also used Moby Dick as a motif. I guess the world is full of coincidences. So would you say conflict over energy is a key theme of MGS5? Yes, I think so. And since it also includes this concept of the vocal cord parasites, it extends to conflict over biological resources as well. That's expressed in Skullface's plan to render nuclear weapons inert, and then control the world with his vocal cord parasite in that vacuum of power. Organisms become a kind of energy and could define the world just like other forms of energy do. And that's not a hollow theory. In whales, the world has already seen organisms be its principal form of energy. Only now, instead of giant whales, the organisms that act as energy or as weapons are tiny microbes and bacteria too small to see with the naked eye. 21st century imagination reaches not for the massive, but for the micro. And we have this chain of ambition and revenge revolving around the tremendous energy, so that's where Kojima-san saw Moby Dick fitting into MGS5. Something I find interesting is how Melville, in the book, ponders how ladies in hoop skirts made with whale baleen were essentially being swallowed by the whale, and as those ancient dames moved about gaily, though in the jaws of the whale, as you may say. The kind of gradual and undetectable infiltration into our everyday lives connects with Kojima-san's concepts of the Patriot system creeping into our society to the point where we actually live inside a system of cultural control. Moby Dick really is a Metal Gear kind of story. Maybe that should be the other way around. Moby Dick and MGS5 also share the theme of revenge in addition to energy. Yes, though Moby Dick is a whaling chronicle, it's also a tale of revenge, and it's not just Ahab that plans to take revenge. Starbuck, the first mate, comes close to taking revenge for the way Ahab almost killed him during their voyage, but he can't bring himself to shoot Ahab in his sleep. He tries to convince himself that since Ahab is likely to kill the whole ship's crew in his mad quest for vengeance, it is for the men's sake that the deed be done. Over in MGS5, we have Quiet, who can't bring herself to kill Snake, and Huey, who insists that everything he's done has been to aid Diamond Dogs, who he still claims are his comrades. And of course we have Snake, who, although he's left with little choice in order to stop the infection, must kill his men to save the rest. Maybe it's just that revenge works that way, but there definitely are lots of parallels. Personal revenge becomes revenge on behalf of your compatriots, and that leads to a cycle of revenge that soon envelops the world. And even Moby Dick, being chased by Ahab, eventually aims to get revenge. As Skullface stated in MGS5, the world is an endless loop of action and reaction. It's always an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. True to that principle, Moby Dick eventually turns on Ahab and fights back. Like Moby Dick, MGS5 is also a tale of revenge. The war for control of energy is a catalyst for that revenge. Whoever can control the energy that defines the world has the power to control the world. There are plots and counterplots, betrayals, and deaths. That's the true breeding ground for repeated acts of retaliation. But all rulers, once they've achieved power, go back and rewrite the bloody path they took to get there with a cover story that makes them seem right. All the plotting and revenge is craftily concealed. If MGS5 had been made under the original concept of Huey being Ishmael, it would have been a great deal darker, and would have left fans far more dissatisfied. I'd say that's up for debate, but that's a topic for another video. Anyway, moving on. Right, after all, from Huey's perspective, he was the only sane person in Diamond Dogs. To him, they are nothing but a murderous militia bent on revenge. So what was the actual reason for changing Ishmael, the narrator, to Big Boss? To answer that, let's start by clarifying what Ahab represents. In the real world, the character of Captain Ahab has often been used to symbolize America's idea of justice. The Sons of Liberty that are the American people believe that their pursuit of happiness and liberty can grant freedom to the whole world. At the root of that belief are the memories of their shame in the eyes of the old world. Although Ahab has only his personal revenge, when the character is superimposed into American righteousness, he serves as an analogy for how justification for revenge based on instinctive national memory is converted into a just cause. Ahab's enemy is Moby Dick, but that image of the white whale has been applied to the Soviet Union, or in the years following 9/11 to Iraq. America, like Ahab, sees itself as a hero. So for Diamond Dogs, Ahab is like an icon for justifying their fight, similar to what America has done over the years. But in MGS5, it's actually America that's the overarching Moby Dick. Big Boss is Ahab in the sense that he's been maimed by America in the past. Big Boss turns his yearning for revenge into bonds that bind him together with comrades who share his wish to retaliate against America, or its self-righteous justifications. However, from America's point of view, it's Big Boss that's Moby Dick. So what we can see in MGS5 is actually an attempt to depict battle between Ahab and Ahab, or perhaps Moby Dick and Moby Dick. The America Ahab leans on its usual crutch of the pursuit of happiness and liberty in terms of maintaining global stability as a justification. Meanwhile, the Big Boss Ahab can't depend on a similar logic. In counterbalancing America's stance, he inevitably makes himself a villain. In fact, he has to act the villain, to expose the fundamental villainy that's hidden in any retaliatory act presented under a righteous justification. So from each side's perspective, their fight is justified. But Big Boss doesn't try to conceal his motives with a righteous justification. He simply keeps building up his private army without a nation for the purpose of revenge and ends up making the world his enemy. To be more precise, the aim is to reveal that the system the world runs on defines Big Boss's existence as evil. That's why MGS5 tells you distinctly that Ahab is you, the player. It says now you have to experience firsthand the absurdity of being branded a villain by the manipulating ways of the global status quo. And once you've experienced that, take the experience and use it. For that message to be put across, it can't be Huey telling it since he's on the American side. It has to be Big Boss himself that delivers the message. Even though the core gameplay is all about expanding your force, in FOB missions we have this option to disarm nuclear weapons. What do you see as the thinking behind this? First off, let's think about this from a time perspective. MGS5 is set in 1984, when the Cold War structure was coming apart at the seams due to factors such as Reagan's Star Wars program and the Soviet Union beginning to show signs of collapse. But we have lived through the history that followed this period, and so we know that fighting in the game of righteousness and fighting in the name of revenge are really two sides of the same coin. The Cold War has ended, the Iraq War has come and gone, and yet the world is in a terrible state right now. If nations continue to appropriate the heroic archetype of one man's revenge and turning it into a justification for war, then eventually the world will be destroyed. Living in the 21st century, we have witnessed that at times ourselves. It's been questioned if America's idea of righteousness is actually right. I think Kojima-san wanted players to experience MGS5 as Big Boss in order to see how the real world works, that retribution and the cycle of revenge are the basis for all war and conflict. What the player experiences after the end of Chapter 2 is the sort of peace that can't yet be achieved in the real world. I think that's the point of the online FOB mode. That's an interesting interpretation of that mode, since it was created as a player versus player mode. Chapter 2 is about having the player go through some extremely tough experiences and see how well they can fulfill the role of Big Boss. To an outside observer, Diamond Dogs is a kind of terrorist organization. They are an extremely dangerous group of individuals who believe they're not doing anything wrong and use force to try to solve conflicts. I think the online FOB mode is about considering what needs to be done to end a cycle of retribution. As of today, November 19th, 2015, it hasn't been triggered yet, but we have heard that if all nuclear weapons in the online FOB mode are decommissioned, a special event occurs. In the online FOB mode, players can come together, even if they disagree in their interpretation of the game, to decommission nukes. In the real world, conflicts created by race, religion, or ideological difference will probably never go away, but I think people can come together to get rid of nukes. At the very least, we can now do this in the game. Even in a fictional world, whatever that world makes you feel is real to you. Thinking about these sort of things is surely the essence of the online FOB mode. And one valid response is to feel that nuclear abolition is possible. This is each player's story to create for themselves. Players creating a story for themselves, that's pretty deep for a piece of entertainment. I think it's a sincere attempt by Kojima-san to remind players they can change the world. At the minimum, using the open world of MGS5, I wonder if there's ever been a story this compelling and crafted with such good faith. There's been a lot of talk, mainly on the internet, about MGS5 being unfinished. What's your take on this? I think there were two stages to this. First, you had a certain number of players who finished Chapter 2 not long after the game came out and went, "What? This Snake wasn't the real Big Boss?" It's similar to the way people reacted to MGS2. Some players couldn't accept that there was a new main character, Raiden, and they got really angry, but now MGS2 is considered a masterpiece. MGS5 is a much longer game than MGS2, so it's like its length amplified that feeling. So you're saying at first people got annoyed about not playing as Snake rather than the game being unfinished? Right, then after this, people started to see the cut Episode 51, The Kingdom of the Flies, which was included on the bonus disc but posted online, and then reaction changed to people asking why this wasn't in the game. In other words, the story arc with Eli being unresolved made people feel the game was incomplete. But personally, I don't think the Kingdom of the Flies episode is essential to the game. Yeah, I'm sorry, but that's bullshit. Sure, maybe it wasn't necessary in terms of metaphors and symbolisms, but in terms of the game's plot, it left an arc in Phantom Pain's story incomplete. It's as simple as that. There were other missions in Phantom Pain that you could label as unnecessary, as they didn't contribute much to advancing the story other than, "Boss, we found a new lead." Many of those missions were there to simply offer more gameplay scenarios, and yet those made the cut and Kingdom of the Flies didn't. Not necessary, my ass. But again, this is a topic for another video, so moving on. You think it's irrelevant? I don't think its absence is the direct cause of this reaction. Up until episode 46, The Man Who Sold the World, players experience the story as Snake, but then they suddenly have the rug pulled out from under them. They find out that they themselves were Big Boss. Then it becomes their story. They themselves participated in the massacre on Mother Base, Quiet's disappearance, Huey's exile. I think the Kingdom of the Flies became an outlet for venting all the unease and confusion that followed that revelation. But really, this fits right into what Kojima-san wanted. Perhaps it's an adverse reaction to the weight put on the player's shoulders. They became Big Boss and experienced themselves becoming a villain, rather than watching him as a third party, and maybe that felt like too heavy a burden. I think that's what it is. Kojima-san wouldn't be satisfied with having the player just thinking, "Wow, Snake's a monster, he killed a bunch of his own men." Kojima-san has talked about giving Snake back to the player with MGS5, and I think this is probably the kind of thing he meant. Yeah, I think they're trying way too hard to find meaning into why people were upset about the missing Mission 51. It has less to do with the plot twist and more to do with the gaping hole left unfilled in Phantom Pain's story. Please get that through your heads. Moving on. With that in mind, episode 43, Shining Lights Even in Death, is a pretty intense part of the game. That's quite a demand he put on the player. To be honest, while that episode will disturb the player, Kojima-san believes that the greatest goal of entertainment is to move the audience, and that he must make games that can do that. I believe that's why he has the player do such a thing. There's some overlap there with the final scene with the boss in MGS3. So with MGS5, Kojima-san has given Snake back to the player. Is this the end of the Metal Gear saga? As a commercial product and as a physical thing, Metal Gear is definitely over, but in a way it isn't. At the start of Moby Dick, the narrator, Ishmael, states that Captain Ahab's story is spun by the three fates, Atropo, Clotho, and Lachesis. Ishmael laments that they have made him the narrator, given him the shabby part of the whaling voyage in order to have him tell Ahab's story. But at the end of the book, Melville gives Ishmael an extraordinary role to fulfill. After the rest of the crew of the Pequod have died, including Ahab himself, he has Ishmael say, "I was he whom the fates ordained to take the place of Ahab's bowsman, when the bowsman assumed the vacant post." And after the Phantom Big Boss dies, the narrator, Ishmael, takes over as Big Boss. Right, it's possible to interpret MGS5 as Ishmael being played by Big Boss, but Ishmael is still the narrator, the will to keep speaking, the will to live the impossible, even after the world has ended. It's the presence of Ishmael that demonstrates it is possible to tell a story in a world that no longer is. We already know the story that leads to this. Think about Snake's famous lines at the end of MGS2. "We need to pass the torch and let our children read our messy and sad history by its light." We have all the magic of the digital age to do that with. The human race will probably come to an end sometime, and new species may rule over this planet. Earth may not be forever, but we still have the responsibility to leave what traces of life we can. Building the future and keeping the past alive are one and the same thing. At the end of episode 46, Ishmael isn't just speaking a message to Snake within the story, but to the player as well. So the line "from here on out, you're Big Boss" could be viewed as symbolic of that. This is a slight digression, but this feeling of MGS5 not being over, this feeling of things being unresolved, these are also present in Moby Dick. Captain Ahab at last challenges Moby Dick, but he's dragged overboard and drowns. There is no climactic battle against his arch-nemesis as one might expect, but many people are under the impression that Ahab died after a struggle to the bitter end. In the novel, not much is made of Ahab's demise. Some say a big contributing factor to this impression was the 1956 cinematic adaptation of Moby Dick, co-written by Ray Bradbury, directed by John Huston, and starring Gregory Peck. In the book, the Zoroastrian character Fedallah battles Moby Dick, but Bradbury gave this role to Ahab instead. The image of Ahab battling the whale, as seen in the film, is more befitting a hero. The image is without a doubt connected to the creation of Ahab as a hero, delivering American justice. The idea of heroism changing in the telling is familiar territory with MGS. As with Moby Dick's Ahab, we also have the image of a hero changing over time as their story is told and retold. A hero steadily becoming idolized to fit what's convenient. Snake has always rejected being spoken of as some legendary hero. In MGS5, by having the player be Snake, each individual player could become Big Boss in whichever way they chose. They became not the hero as stories spoke of him, but the hero he actually was. This is like taking Bradbury's version of Ahab and returning him to how he originally was. I see, and that's something the player must experience themselves, not just hear about in a story. In the world of Metal Gear post-MGS5, Ahab is killed by Solid Snake, but Big Boss, Ishmael, lives on. The events of Metal Gear games always bring the world to the brink. What saved Big Boss and the world was Ahab, the player, in MGS5. So it's actually the player who brings the series full circle. That's quite an amazing setup. I remember Kojima-san saying in the debriefing video something like, "I think fans will be happy with it." Making Big Boss Ishmael the narrator and the player Ahab another Big Boss was done in order to have the player fulfill the final role in the Metal Gear saga, saving the world on the brink of ending, and at the same time saving this saga that had to come to an end at some point. They had to carry out the greatest mission in the series. In the series world, Ahab is killed by Solid Snake, but he's still alive in our world, since we are Ahab. There are countless Big Bosses in our world. So in a way, Metal Gear ends with MGS5, but in another way it continues. We can be Big Boss now. We can all hold our heads high and work to save the world, our real world. So let's do that. Why not, right? I think this is the empty space Kojima-san has given us through MGS5. So there you have it, folks, the full interview. Gives you a lot to think about, huh? While I disagree with their interpretation of why people were upset at MGS5, their deep insight into the story really does shed some new light onto Phantom Pain. Now, just because something is deep and chock full of meaningful metaphors and symbolisms doesn't make it a good story. As I've stated before, I think what MGS5 attempts with its storytelling, and in many ways succeeds, is incredibly cool, but when it comes to its core story and plot, it's hard not to be disappointed, especially as a Metal Gear fan, but again, I'll talk more about the matter in the follow-up video. I still need some time to process all this information to formulate my own thoughts. But in the meantime, let us know in the comments below your thoughts and opinions about Kenji Yano's interpretation. Do you agree or disagree with him? Did any of this information change your thoughts about Phantom Pain in the slightest? Let us know in the comments below. And to be further updated on gaming news, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.